So I am really, really happy to have Howard here today. I know that you have led a number of bird walks here at the Senior Center, and although that isn't an option to us right now, I appreciate you coming by virtually to share some of the information you have about birds in our area. So welcome, Howard.
Well, thank you very much. And it's really, obviously I'm a little nervous about this. It's easier to look at people face to face in front of the Senior Center and feel the breeze in our faces. But we're going to try to make this work in the virtual surroundings that we are living with right now. I thought I would start out this morning to look at the positives with appreciation for the power of nature to nourish us on a daily basis. The current restrictions on meeting together, on sports, on entertainment, limit the distractions in our lives and give us a wonderful opportunity to observe and to add a new level of appreciation for the wonders of nature in all of its beauty. We're all aware that observing birds is one of the most common ways that people observe nature. And our island environment attracts birds with multiple types of habitats. And we are fortunate to be surrounded by forests and gardens and the sea. And we're on the migratory pathways of many birds. So we have an ideal opportunity here to walk in our neighborhood, to walk in the park, to walk in the forest, to just look out the window and see the birds that are around us. And we know that we are nourished in spirit by our natural surroundings. We also know that we also know that when we observe our natural surroundings, we can improve our physical health. Several Japanese physicians have researched the effects of being present in our natural surroundings. They have shown remarkable improvement in the reduction of stress hormones and improving the human body's immune mechanisms in those who spent time paying attention to their forest surroundings. The Japanese term for this experience is Shinrin-yoku, which we translate as forest bathing. This means immersing ourselves, in the environment that we are in. Experience our natural surroundings with our whole being, to use our eyes, to use our ears, to use all of our senses, and really pay attention to where we are and what we're doing. And that in the natural surroundings is a peaceful way to add to our lives, and it also improves our physical health. Bird watching is another way to take advantage of the unintended benefits of the changes in our lifestyle, which we're all dealing with in the time of this pandemic. Since we are not gathering in groups, I thought we'd try a virtual bird walk. Now, there are many ways to get involved in bird study. The fundamental way is to learn to identify the birds. The most helpful way to really learn birds is to just learn to pay attention to them. Many bird watchers like to, but the most common way, I think, is to learn to identify the birds by name. Many bird watchers keep lists of birds that they've seen, sometimes life lists, and that can be a whole a number of complexities in the way that you watch birds. But there are other types of observation. You can just notice the beauty, the pretty flash of color that goes across your path or sits on the fence beside you. Or you can appreciate the beautiful songs that are all around us. We can focus on the habits of birds, notice where they are likely to show up and how they behave. Or we can get involved in a more in-depth study of bird behavior, nesting, and migration patterns, and the protection of endangered species. So many ways that we can get involved with birds. The first thing that I would like to talk about is learning how to identify birds in the field. My memory of the period of time when I was first introduced to bird watching was with college friends who would identify birds by name, often when seen at some distance. They would note aspects of their behavior which had escaped my observation entirely. And I began to understand that common birds had common size and color and behavior patterns. However, in the field guide of birds, there were often several birds that had those similar characteristics. So how do you distinguish between the different types of birds? Initially, I believe it is helpful to learn the basic organization of a bird record or field guide. Birds are typically organized in families, beginning with the more primitive birds and grouping families that are closely related together. Ducks and geese and swans are in the same area of the bird guide. Finches and sparrows are in another area of the bird guide. When learning which of the birds in any one particular grouping they are commonly found in your geographical area, you can eliminate many of the birds that are in the bird guide, and that reduces the number of birds that you have to eliminate or think about when you're trying to identify a particular bird. When there are rare exceptions, but almost all of the birds that you will see are common in your area. Once you have learned the general organization of related bird families and note size and shape and color, identifying markings and behavior become helpful identifying characteristics. It's easy to tell a crow from a duck. It's easy to tell a robin from a chickadee. Markings and coloration are quite consistent within a species. Adult males look very much alike throughout that species. There are often significant differences in color and markings between male and female. And young birds have different markings, sometimes different markings entirely. And then birds have different coloration and markings, oftentimes in the summer from the winter. So getting acquainted with the general characteristics of that species is the helpful way to identify the birds by individual. Once you've eliminated a number of birds from the possible list, then you should begin to look for more specific identifying markings. Pay attention to the bill. Often the shape of the bill or the color of the bill is helpful in separating the birds that are closely related from each other. At times, the color of the legs and the feet are important characteristics. Often birds have separate markings on their wings, or on their tail, or on the rump of the bird that help identify the specific bird. And habitat and behavior are important characteristics. Is the bird on the ground or in the low bushes, or are they often on the move through the trees above? Often small flocks who are feeding together are moving together through the trees that are overhead. Other birds are more solitary and seen alone. So that's another helpful characteristic. And then, of course, paying attention to their songs and their calls. Each species has a distinct vocalization, often with specific messaging depending on the circumstances at that moment. So they do have a vocabulary. We are all familiar with the early morning singing of the robin, especially in the spring. The crows call more like sometimes conversation, at times aggressive warnings, at other times more conversational. Each species has its own individual repertoire which we can learn to identify, and sometimes birds can be identified by sound even if you can't see them. To really be successful in identifying birds, it's helpful to have a good pair of binoculars. Binoculars come in a wide range of strengths and clarity. binoculars that are best for bird watching tend to be 7 or 8 power. If you have a higher power, a 10 power, which is the amount of magnification that you get with the binoculars, is nice for seeing more detail, but it's hard to follow birds when they're moving with 10 power. So 7 or 8 power is probably what you're looking for. And then the binoculars are going to be listed by two numbers: the power and then the width of the opening. And the greater the width of the opening, the more light that you get in and the more detail that you can see in the bird. It makes the binoculars easier to use. So binoculars, a choice of binoculars is oftentimes a trade-off between price and the ability of the binoculars to make it easy to identify the birds. Another thing that's helpful when you're watching birds is to have an app that is on your phone. There are many different apps that identify birds, but the one that I like the best is by the Audubon Society. And they include photos of birds. They often show the differences in the appearance of the male and the female, and sometimes the immature. They show the geographical range of the bird and descriptions of what their migration patterns are. And then they have recordings, actually, of the songs, which are helpful in identifying what you're hearing. But also you can use that when you're out in the field to call in the birds. If you play a bird call, a bird that you suspect is in your area, it may come around to check you out. So as you become more familiar with the most common species in your area, you'll begin to see the behavior patterns for this species. And this may raise new questions. You may want to get more involved in the details of bird migration, or how they adapt to changing conditions, or things that are being done to preserve their numbers. Recently, I was introduced to a new publication by David Sibley, a well-known bird scientist from Massachusetts and author of several field guides. In his most recent book, What's It Like to Be a Bird?, he discusses his observations about bird intelligence, the abilities they have in modifying their behavior in response to changing conditions. He notes that a bird's experience is far richer, more complex, and more thoughtful than I'd ever imagined. And he's been studying birds for decades. Although instinct is a central part of how birds learn, behavior of their species is not an automatic determinant of the details that they need to have in order to deal with changing conditions. They are still required to make multiple decisions to how to choose a mate, or when and where to build a nest, or what food sources are available to feed the young once they have them, how to adjust nest materials when they have changing conditions. And birds generally live only 1 or 2 years, so these decisions are often made by birds in the first nesting season without any other birds to show them how. There are so many ways that we can learn from and enjoy the behavior of birds that are all around us. So I'd like to begin our actual bird walk with looking at a common bird. I think one of the best ways of getting started with bird watching is to really learn to identify well a few common birds that are in your area, and then you'll begin to understand what kinds of things you have to watch for, and how to separate different types of birds. For our bird walk today, we will look at one of the most commonly seen birds on Bainbridge, and that's the American robin. And if we could have the first slide. American robin was named robin after the English robin, which is the national bird of England, because our robin shares the reddish breast. However, the English robin and the American robin are not at all related. The English robin is a flycatcher, and our robin is a thrush. Different families entirely. When we get a good look at the orange-red breast, they are easy to recognize by their general size and color, even when seen from a distance. The posture is upright. They appear to stand with their heads held up high. Their head and back are black, darker on the male. They have a yellow circle around the eye and white and black streaks on the chin above the orange breast. The beak is mostly yellow with some black streaks. Although the male and female appearance is very similar, the female has more subdued coloration. When you get to know the songs, you will easily recognize the musical chorus that is often the first bird song that you hear in the morning. And I'm going to give you an example of the robin song, which most of you are probably familiar with. So when you learn that song, then of course you know the robins are in your area, even if you're not able to see them. And the robins, as I said, are in the thrush family, and the thrushes tend to have beautiful songs. For comparison, I'm going to play for you another song by another thrush called the Swainson's thrush. The Swainson's thrush is the Brene Fleming of the bird family. So if you hear this, you can recognize this bird easily. The Swainson's thrush is much less often seen than the robin. The Swainson's thrush tends to live only in the deep forest. But on the island, you can hear it in several places, and sometimes they'll even come around and check you out, especially if you play that recording back for them. Robins live in most parts of North America, and they are very common this time of year. Here they are often seen on the lawns of Waterfront Park or Battle Point Park. They will be seen along the road or in people's yards. They will be found singing loudly from their perch in another perch in trees or shrubbery, which is slide 3. We missed the Swainson's thrush, didn't we? There was the Swainson's thrush. Quite a bit less dramatic than the robin. And then the next slide, robins are often found up in the trees, and so don't only look on the ground. Many robins live in the Pacific Northwest year-round. In the winter, they will be found here, even with snow covering the landscape, and that's slide 4. And that was taken here in our marina. So in the summer, the ground is softer when it's not so cold, and the worms are more active, and there are more insects. And so that's why the robins are seen on the ground in the summer. In the wintertime, the ground is hard, oftentimes frozen, and so robins change their diet and eat fruit and berries primarily. And the next slide shows not a very good picture, but it does show a robin in our backyard here with a berry in their mouth. The next slide will show the migratory patterns of robins. As you can see, the dark purple color, those robins live here year-round. During the summer, some robins migrate to northern Canada and Alaska and for mating. However, many of the robins stay in the states for mating as well. But the robins that live in the colder U.S. climates, colder parts of the country, do migrate south during the winter time. And the light blue color is where they go when they're escaping the cold in the rest of the country. And the next slide shows that even though we think of robins as being solitary creatures, when they migrate, actually from the colder northern climates, you may have hundreds of them in the same flock. And they will go from 30 to 100 miles a day. So they can cover quite a bit of territory, and then they'll stop for a few days and feed, and then go on. Migration for robins is not so much based strictly on the temperature changes, but it is based primarily on the changes in the food sources that are available during different seasons. Robins are among the earliest birds to return to their breeding grounds in the spring, often in early March. The males arrive first and choose to defend nesting territories. Robin nests are usually built on branches of shrubs or trees above the ground, and at the beginning of the breeding season, the males grow new feathers to enhance the darkness of their head and back and the red color of their breast to be more attractive to the females. They are very competitive for females and sometimes will fight with each other. While both male and female gather materials for nest building, the female does most of the construction of the nest itself. After the eggs are laid, the female does all of the incubation of the eggs, and she incubates them, keeping them warm nearly continuously during the first week after the eggs hatch. The fledglings develop a full coat of feathers by the end of 1 week after hatching. At that time, they are able to maintain their temperature in a safe range without the mother keeping them warm, and this allows both parents to spend more time foraging for food to feed the rapidly growing young. During this period, each of the young will consume its body weight in each day. So during the second week of their life, they consume their body weight in food each day. This requires the parents to bring more food to the nest several times an hour during the day. Robins are monogamous once they have mated until the eggs hatch. The male and female both feed the young. They often have 2 or 3 nests of eggs during the season, and the male will continue to tend to the young while the female begins a new nest for another brood. Robins typically live only 1 or 2 years, although they have been known to live as long as 7 years. The robin eggs are a beautiful blue color. We're all familiar with the robin egg blue. Studies have shown that the darker and the more vibrant the color of the eggs, the better the male attends to the young after they are hatched. The typical nest contains 4 eggs. The eggs hatch after about 2 weeks, and it takes another 2 weeks for the young birds to leave the nest. Young birds have light spots on their gray backs, similar markings to the adults, but much less dramatic, much less dramatic colors. Yeah. Robins are often thought of as symbols of good luck, of new beginnings. A robin in your garden indicates the arrival of a new season, of new possibilities. The morning chorus of the robin starts the new day with beauty and melody. We are fortunate to have them surrounding us, adding to the natural wonders of our world. Another approach to adding additional birds to your bird list is to pay attention to some of the more visible or colorful birds when we see them, even if we do not see them very often. This last week, my wife and I were exploring some old trails we had not walked for a couple of years. We were walking the Rockaway Bluff Trail along the top of the bluff behind Rockaway Beach. This is a wonderful trail in a stand of secondary growth forest with easy access. Along the trail, we heard and then saw a pair of hairy woodpeckers feeding their young in their nest in a dead tree. So if we could have the next slide. So here's a picture of the hairy woodpecker. You can see this is a male because we'll see this better in a future picture, but there's a little bit of spot of red on the back of the head. And here's the young poking its head out, waiting for the male to give it that insect that's in its bill. Next slide. And you can see sometimes they get impatient and and want to come out and get something sooner. And then the next slide shows the female, and you can see the female does not have the red spots on the back of the head. The hairy woodpeckers are primarily a black body in the back, especially with a white stripe down the back. The hairy woodpecker and the downy woodpecker are two similar related species on our island, which are similar to each other. So the next slide will show the hairy woodpecker is a larger bird. It is approximately 9 inches long, almost as big as a robin. And here you can see the male with red markings on the back of the head. And then the next slide will show the downy woodpecker, which is similar in markings, but much smaller, almost not much more than the size of a sparrow. This is a 6-inch bird, and so we'll find probably see more of the downy woodpeckers on our island than the hairy woodpeckers, but we find them both here. And you can see here that the bill is very short and stubby compared to the long bill of the, I want to go back one slide. You can see the difference in the bill is an easily identifying characteristic. Sometimes it's hard to tell the size of a bird when you're seeing it by itself. So we could go to the next. On Bainbridge, we see a total of 5 different species of woodpeckers. They're not so often visible because they tend to stay most of the time deep in the forest. Certainly the most visible is the Pileated Woodpecker. This bird is 17 inches long, so this is a much bigger bird. And it's much noisier than the other woodpeckers. It's easily identified with this large red crest. In the next slide, you may find a pile of sawdust at the base of a tree where this bird has made a nest. It's remarkable how much nesting material, how much wood these birds can get out of the dead trees where they're making their nests. We also have the northern flicker on our island. That's the next slide. And this bird occurs across the United States. In the western United States, for some reason, the underside of the wings tends to be more red. So these are called red-shafted flickers. And on the East Coast, it's more yellow, so they're yellow-shafted flickers. But the general appearance of the flickers is similar. And these are a little bit more visible. Oftentimes, I've seen them in Waterfront Park, or seen them and heard them. And then one of the most spectacular woodpeckers, which we very seldom see, but Janet and I were very fortunate see one also on that trip where we saw the nesting hairy woodpeckers is the next slide is the red-breasted sapsucker. And this woodpecker varies, whereas most woodpeckers eat insects by drilling into the bark and catching the insects and grubs that are under the bark. This one goes under the bark and takes the sap from the tree. But it's a spectacular bird. There are many other types of birds for us to study on Bainbridge. Hopefully we will be able to go out together before too long and have a bird walk in the field. But it's a wonderful way to help expand our horizons. Thank you for giving me time to talk about them.